It's Tuesday, December 31, 2019, and this is the 5-minute podcast review, sneaking in 3 more podcasts to check out before the end of the decade. First up is Rumble with Michael Moore, and surprisingly, this is Michael Moore's first swing at podcasting, but he's doing it with a mission, and that mission is to get Donald Trump out of office in 2020. He's very upfront, that's what the podcast is all about. He says he's abandoned other media activity for the year, such as making a film or a TV series, to focus all effort on the podcast and its mission. And listening to the setup episode, it's interesting to hear his take on the advantages podcasting has over other forms of mass media, particularly that podcasts are not expensive to produce, they're pretty much instant, and they cut out the middleman. So here's a bit of Michael Moore in his own words. It picks up where he's talking about his favourite possession as a kid, a tape recorder on which he'd record all his thoughts.
But the problem with that, and I thought about this at the time, is that I'm recording all of this, but I can't really share it with anybody. I can play it for my parents at home. I can listen to it, but who else can hear it? Nobody. What was I going to do? Go to the local radio station? Hey, I'm 9 years old. Play this on the radio. There was no way to reach people outside of your own small little group of family and friends. That's the way it was until the last decade or so, when we could take our voices and share them with each other without having to go through the middleman. And so here we are today with this podcast. And I'm now able to talk to God knows how many of you. I mean, those of you who learned about this today from my social media, there's almost 10 million of you who follow me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or the other stuff. So I have no idea, as I sit here right now, how many of you are out there. But I know you're there. And at 9 and 10 years old, I couldn't do that. There was no means to do that. You had to own a radio station. You had to own a TV station. Who could do that? Only the wealthy, only those with money, whether they were those in town for the local stuff or nationwide, the networks. No means to talk to each other unless it went through the filter and the approval of those who would grant any of us a show or a moment or whatever on the radio, on TV, in the paper. Not anymore. Huge mistake. If anybody in power is listening, huge mistake to allow us to talk to each other, because you know what we're going to end up doing with this. We're not just going to take pictures of our food. We're not just going to play pranks on each other. We're not going to just sit here and blow up because we can. We can do it anonymously even. This device that I'm speaking into, the device that you're listening to me through right now, no network executive having any say as to what I can say or what you can hear. Nobody controls you and I right now.
Okay, so it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out, and you can follow along using the link on your screen or just search Rumble with Michael Moore. Next up, a podcast from Scotland called Pass It On. This podcast springs from a Reader's Household Tips column that was started in a Scottish newspaper more than 50 years ago. The tips now sound quaint and dated, of another era, though a few still have relevance today, but the 3 hosts of Pass It On, who span different generations, use the tips as a springboard to riff about how attitudes have changed over the decades. And for many of us who aren't Scottish, there's also the fun of navigating the accent and deciphering some of the local words. Here's a clip just to give you a good feel for what Pass It On is all about.
And not just, that was why we sort of decided, the 3 of us, Steve, Connie and me, we decided that we'd have a crack at this podcast, because it's not just the tips themselves are interesting or even
or wrong
or dare I say it, useful. Some of them probably will be quite useful as we flick through the 2 or 3 that Steve's
definitely useful
already given us a little flavour of. Might be useful, but also there's just so much packed into them. They encode so much. There's so much sort of domain knowledge about the 1950s and about households, society, gender roles packed into these. And I'm really interested to see, especially with you, Connie, what you make of them.
Yeah, definitely.
Connie, as a young lady, I promise you're going to get a lot out of this, because in many ways this is a social history as well as a little thing that just was tucked in the side of a page and hidden in the archives for 50 years. Right, to prove that, I'm going to give you a tip that you will find useful. You ready?
Yeah.
Cap saver. When taking the cap off a bottle which you wish to reseal, place a coin on top of the cap before applying the bottle opener. This prevents the cap being dented and enables you to reseal the bottle. That, believe it or not, is from Mrs. W.A. Allen, General Deliver, Innisfail, Alberta, Canada.
Oh, international.
I know.
Yeah. Well, the Sunday Post had a great circulation with expats out throughout Canada, South Africa, Australia, that sort of thing. And they would all write in because it was
the done
brilliant.
thing.
It was the done thing. That's another thing. I must say that about the tips. If you had a tip printed in the Sunday Post, that marked you out as a housewife of distinction. Ladies would carry cuttings from the Sunday Post and take it out and say, here's when I was in the Sunday Post.
The little halo above their head.
Indeed, a golden light shone upon them. Even if somebody in their street had a tip printed, they would haul that out or boast about it because that showed that they came from a nice area, nice neighbourhood.
Posh end.
Indeed. The amount of tips that we got through as well and the amount of subjects that are covered, again, feed this being a social history, a recipe for life almost. And while some of the times I know you guys are going to laugh about these tips.
Definitely.
And we're definitely going to laugh specifically at you, Steve.
Yeah.
Well, that's fair enough.
For believing them.
People of my age don't care if you young whippersnappers laugh. What do you know? Do you know how to get the beetroot stains out of a cloth? No, you
Shove it in the wash.
Throw it out.
Shove it in the wash. It doesn't work.
Okay, so it's strange to be suggesting that a household tips podcast could be entertaining listening, but as you could hear, Pass It On is more than just that. Anyhow, if you feel like adding something different to your playlist for the occasional listen, check out Pass It On. And just to finish, more a podcast episode recommendation than the podcast itself, it's the Gotcha episode of the Love and Radio podcast. It dropped on November 21, and as I said, the episode is titled Gotcha. I don't think I've really listened to the Love and Radio podcast, but somehow, I can't actually remember how, I stumbled across the Gotcha episode and gave it a listen. But anyway, it turned out to be one of those stories, a true story, where you sit in the car even when you've arrived at your destination just to hear how it ends. And yes, I know one of the benefits of a podcast over radio is you don't actually have to do that, but you know what I mean. So I can't really say too much about the episode without spoiling it, but I'll just say, if you find those FM radio breakfast teams annoying, especially when they do things like prank calls, then you'll like this episode. So look, I'll put a link of the Gotcha episode on your screen. Just trust me on this one and give it a listen. Okay, that's it for this episode where we wrapped up the decade looking at Rumble with Michael Moore, Pass It On, and the Gotcha episode of Love and Radio. Links to all three are on your screen, and I'll speak to you again in 2020. Thanks for listening.